Well, we are blessed, aren't we? How rich are our speakers. Thank you. And another one to come. These are two of the youngest senators in our federal parliament, by the way. Senator Fatima Payman and Jordon Steele John. I like that, you know, young, fresh ideas. Yeah, very good. So thank you all for being here. Now, Jordon Steele John, British-born Australian and disability rights advocate. He was largely responsible for the recent inquiry, the government inquiry into disability rights around the country, and that was a huge achievement. So we are very lucky to have two amazing young senators in our midst. And I know that Jordon has also been a Green spokesperson on peace and disarmament issues, and a lot of wisdom for such a young person. So welcome to you, Jordon, and let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Now let me just check everybody in terms of volume. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, great. My voice has been teetering on the edge of dying for the last 24 hours, but I think we can get through this together. But if I do quieten down, let me know up at the back. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here on unceded First Nations Noongar Whadjuk Whadjuk. We are here in Bulu, Perth, not far from the banks of the Derbarl Yarragon. And this acknowledgement of elders past and present, of the reality that sovereignty was never ceded, is always important. I would argue that it is vital when we are coming together as we are tonight to talk about issues of peace, issues of cohabitation of the planet, issues of war. Because in the history of the nation which now calls itself Australia, constructed as it is on this ancient continent, and possessing as it does such a history of participation in warfare, there is no more vital acknowledgement and recognition than the reality that the most significant war ever fought on this land or by its settler peoples is the war for control of this continent that was started by the arrival of the British and European imperial powers. Whether it be in Pinjarra, whether it be across in Lutruwita, Tasmania, and the Black Line, whether it be the Queensland Mounted Police, the white imperial administration expanded its control of this continent at the point of a bayonet with military precision and sought to ethnically cleanse and to perpetually control the First Nations peoples of this continent. And if the nation now existing ever truly seeks to live in peaceful cooperation within what is now called the Asia-Pacific region, or alongside its so-called Pacific Island neighbors, then the governments of this land must acknowledge the connection between the existence of this nation and the imperialism which so deeply blighted and continues to negatively affect the Asia-Pacific region. I'm incredibly proud to be sharing a space this evening with those with the courage and conviction to speak for peace. And I am deeply aware that to do so requires strength. Because when we speak for peace, those in positions of power who profit from violence respond, be silent. They dismiss and they belittle, whether it be those who own large newspapers, who frame those who speak for peace as a threat to the community, or whether it be the awkward conversation around the dinner table as you attempt to speak to the family member that maybe spends a little bit too much time in front of Sky News for their own comfort. It takes effort and energy to speak for peace at a time when violence and the state-sanctioned murder known as war is normalized by corporate entities and political parties who profit and benefit from that process. And yet our history as a peace movement in Western Australia and across this continent is a history of speaking for peace, of collaborating, of campaigning, of pushing, and of ultimately being vindicated in that work. Whether it be the dissenters who refused to go across the sea to fight the British Empire's wars in the First World War, whether it be those who came together to oppose the war in Vietnam, whether it be those who came together to call out the mutually assured madness that was the Cold War, whether it's those who gathered in Sydney, in Perth, across the planet in the largest organized demonstration of collective human will in opposition to the war in Iraq. Our history as a movement may have been met in moments of ostracization and sometimes in failure, as well as success. But sadly, always with vindication after the passage of time. If we had avoided involvement in Vietnam, what might we have done with the wealth and opportunity and hope of those decades? If we had refused to participate in George Bush and Tony Blair's illegal and immoral invasion of Iraq, what might the decade, that first crucial decade of the millennium, held for our nation and our region? And so now we come as a movement to this moment of AUKUS, this engineered political pact created by defense personnel and weapons companies and the odd compliant and unimaginative politician. They do exist. And foisted upon our community without any preparation or opportunity for us as a community to analyze. Former Premier Lawrence, I think, is absolutely right to say that this is a proposal which was developed by what we in this room understand to be the military-industrial complex and its various advocates, but most certainly designed by a Prime Minister in Scott Morrison, who expected it to create a political point of difference ahead of an election. And in fact, the three men in their infinite wisdom who put the idea of AUKUS into the world, Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, and Scott Morrison, there's three blokes you'd really trust to run a lemonade stand. They put it into the world driven by domestic, national, political interest. Morrison wanted a point of difference before the election. Johnson wanted to be well, literally anywhere other than Westminster at the time, he would have gladly taken an exchange in Kiev under rocket fire for the Houses of Parliament, and Morrison's administration was dying. And all of them thought that they could get a piece of, both of them thought they could get domestic political wins out of it, but out of the three, Joe Biden needed it most, because we had just witnessed the exit from Afghanistan. Those 20 years of blood and wandering in the desert, and as we now know, violent crimes beyond any boundaries of the laws of war perpetrated by Australian soldiers and American soldiers and British soldiers, to our everlasting shame. And that had come crushing down, and not since the fall of Saigon had the American empire's fragility and the limited nature of its ability to control those masses over which they had militarily occupied been so publicly exposed. And so there was a need to reassert American power, because in the absence of power, imperialism folds. Imperial structures collapse so quickly. And so they jumped on Zoom together. And I never forget the moment when Joe Biden says, I'm very grateful to be here with Boris Johnson and that man from down under. He couldn't even remember Morrison's name. And yet, 24 hours later, the Australian Labor Party, with all of its historical links to the peace movement, particularly the anti-Vietnam movement, and for some sections, the anti-Iraq war movement, in 24 hours, the leadership had folded and signed up and signed on, as though they were the first into the recruiting booth in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. You know, they saw the "I want you" poster and they went in. And that was the end, they thought, of the political discussion over AUKUS. It would be bipartisan, it would be in stone, and opposition would be relegated to the fringes. And yet, our Australian and global peace movement continued to push. In response to the command to be silent, we have continued to speak for peace, and led by journalists and academics, community organizers, and politicians of purpose and moral clarity, community members committed to ensuring that we as a human species continue to survive and to thrive, have picked away at the facade of this political edifice and continue to reveal to the public the reality of the betrayal and the intellectual emptiness of the political leaders which have signed us up to this proposal. And as we have picked away, and I am proud as an Australian Green Senator to be here, not only as the latest in a line of MPs going all the way back to the fabulous Joe Valentine, who have taken, and a round of applause for Joe, who have entered that lion's den of toxic masculinity and intellectual vacancy known as the Australian Parliament, and championed peace and championed a different way. And we together have discovered that that which was put to us as immovable was in fact a facade. There was no commitment to deliver Australian capacity for a nuclear submarine.
No.
There is in fact there is a very clear commitment to deliver billions of dollars in public funds to some of the largest weapons manufacturers in the world in order to keep their nuclear submarine industries afloat. There is a very clear commitment that should we exit the agreement, none of that money is coming back.
No.
But there is no commitment to deliver so much as a dinghy to the Australian Defence Force. Now, I'm quite glad of that because that means that we as a community can push to get out of this thing without ever needing really to seriously engage with the question of what would we do instead. Because the reality is the Australian nuclear industry, the shipbuilding industry, does not have the capacity to provide us with Virginia-class submarines. They can't make enough for themselves. So if it isn't about boats and it isn't about a two-way transfer of technology or even of money, what truly is AUKUS about? And finding an answer to that question has been most of my work in the foreign policy and defence space for the last 4 years. And I have come to the conclusion that AUKUS is about the manufacture of global political consent. While there is an idea in the minds of the Australian public and in the minds of senior politicians that America may provide Australia with a vitally needed defence capacity, there is an incredible amount of leverage sitting in the American hand in relation to our foreign policy. And we have seen that leverage used during the Israeli genocide in Gaza to devastating effect. Silence in the face of genocide is complicity. Silence in the face of war crimes is complicity. Silence against and in the face of the decimation that we have seen before the people of Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem is a permanent stain upon the human character. And that complicity has been able to be manufactured here in Australia because every decision made by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister is run through the lens, how will this make Washington feel?
Yeah.
And though that question might not be new, the ramifications of the answer have never been deeper. Because if Washington's unhappy, we're not getting our submarines.
Yeah.
And if we're not getting our submarines, then we've failed in national defence. And if we've failed in national defence, well, then what's the point in either of us? When we have elevated as Labour and Liberal national defence as the pinnacle of good governance. And so I have sat in the Senate, and Fatima has been there for most of this time now, and listened to our foreign minister, commissioned by an Australian government, elected by an Australian public, make statement after statement that is little more than a vaguely reworked copy and paste of either the last thing the State Department put out or the last thing the State Department approved for the Canadian State Department to put out. And it is an embarrassment and a shame on this nation, which deserves an independent and peaceful foreign policy. This nation who in times past has demonstrated an ability to work with independence, to work with intellectual vigor, to work with those of different points of view to craft peaceful and long-lasting solutions, whether it be in Cambodia or whether it be the Antarctic Treaty.
Yeah.
One of the finest contributions to international law, developed in direct opposition to the American State Department, but we did it anyway, and the world didn't end and the sky didn't fall in. And apparently, I believe, Tasmania is still located vaguely where it was previously. We have done these things in these moments, and it is that type of leadership that the people of our communities deserve. and is demanded of governments in moments such as this. And here's the thing, and this is where I'll end. So much of how we've come to be here today, and so much of the history we've covered together, is a history of corporations and the powerful attempting and successfully taking what should be or is owed to people and planet for their own and for their own purpose. They take our public funds. In AUKUS's case, $368 billion. And when I add that times 3 metric that Carmen mentioned before, it is almost a figure unfathomable to a human being. They take our political discourse and normalize within it murder and the machinery of war and its manufacture as the highest state to which an employee or an engineer could ever aspire. They take our communities, as we've heard from Lisa, and turn them from pristine places of dynamism and hope to those places which serve only their needs, and when their needs are satiated, they move on. The one thing they haven't yet managed to take, in Australia at least, is our votes. They have not yet taken our votes. And though the corporations that donate to them are giving many millions of dollars to ensure that the parties they own are always perpetually in power, people are sick of it. People are deeply frustrated. And that frustration is reaching into the parliament. There's a reason why the cross benches of both houses are bigger than they've ever been before. It's because the pressure is building.
Yes.
It's because the people's desire for change is shaking the foundation of that palace of ignorance. And we must continue to shake it together. We must continue to utilize our voices, to speak for peace, and yet to vote for peace. Because the treaties that enable this sham to continue, the transfer of money from the public pocket to the pocket of GE and all of these other companies, they come through the Senate. They can be either voted down or disallowed by the Senate. And with a majority in favor of peace in the Senate, that's what the Senate will do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, my friends. I look forward to continuing to collaborate together as we build an independent and peaceful Australia. Thank you.